Today's event is part of our Collection Connections series, in which beloved folk art instructors help uplift and spotlight some of the unique items in Vesterheim's collection. Now, I want to introduce my colleague, Lorianne Gilbertson. Today, Lorianne will be available to field questions about the items in Vesterheim's collection, while I will be watching the chat for any questions related to technology or back of house issues, as well as fielding your questions. Thanks for being here, Lorianne.
Thank you. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Carol Colburn. Carol's background in theater, art history, and human ecology has led her to study the history of textiles and clothing from many perspectives. Her continuing interest in Norwegian American clothing has resulted in many projects and publications inspired by the collection at Vesterheim. She turns to material culture methodologies for this work, for hands-on exploration of weave structures, garment cut, and sewing techniques. In addition to researching historical garments for what they tell us today, Carol teaches heritage sewing workshops at North House Folk School in Grand Marais, Minnesota, and John C. Campbell Folk School in Brasstown, North Carolina. She joins us from Duluth, Minnesota. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you, Lorianne, and thank you to Vesterheim Folk Art School and Andrew Ellingson also. It's been great working with you thus far. And I want to thank the Nordic Center of Duluth, because I am actually speaking today from the Nordic Center. Audience, it's wonderful you've been able to join this event today. I have built in question pauses at intervals during this discussion. And because I'm talking about 4 different dresses in sequence, and it might be kind of confusing as to which one we're looking inside. So between each dress, I have some nature scenes. So when you see those scenes, you'll know you're going on to a different dress. And you might take that little pause of a nature slide to jot down some questions in the Q&A. The next slide will take you to Vesterheim, inside a Vesterheim Folk School classroom, where students have the unmatched opportunity to find inspiration from items from the collection. These are views of my classroom for a Sew with Handwovens class, and on the table is one of the handwoven dresses that I'll be talking about today. In the classroom, the dress is only handled with white gloves, as you see on the left. But today, you'll be able to see inside and be inspired by materials and techniques that we can see from the comfort of your home. For the next slide, we'll go on to the 3 dresses that I've chosen to speak about, and they all have really interesting histories in them. They're each representing a different decade from around the mid-19th century, 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. At the core of my interest in clothing is clothing as language. What is the sentence that's composed when a person chooses their presentation? Perhaps the clothing items are nouns and accessories are modifiers. And for immigrant populations, then and now, and also as time passes, messages can easily be misunderstood. I think of these dresses from the Vesterheim collection as transitional, in that those who wore them have histories both in Norway and America. And perhaps for this reason, they were saved within Norwegian American families to remember the older clothing dialogue. We sometimes think of folk dress as before immigration. And we know the Norwegian bunad tradition reflects that time. And this is partly true, but actually these dresses, which reflected international fashion, were used in Norway also during the years of mass immigration. They represented an international style, but in this case, the fabrics were still produced on a hand loom rather than being the product of a commercial textile mill. Another way we can think of these garments as transitional is that these are entirely hand-sewn garments. And this was a period of time when machine-made garments were becoming possible. The machine was introduced in about 1840. So each one of these dresses, will be interesting to look at in that light too. For these dresses, I've assembled family history, looked at style features, construction techniques, fabric detail, and evidence of wear from the initial owner. And yet, with all this careful analysis, there are still interesting questions that need to be continually asked. There's still a lot more to learn. So I mentioned that these represent 3 decades. On the left, it's the 1840s. This dress would have been made before immigration in Norway, in the region of Buskerud. And it's remarkable in my mind, specifically for the fiber used to make it and very fine quality of spinning and weaving, which we'll look at later. The middle dress was also made before immigration in the decade of the 1850s, and it was made in northern Norway. And I find it most remarkable for surprising techniques of hand sewing that we can see inside the dress. And the third dress I find remarkable as a surviving example of a dress with spinning, dyeing, weaving, and sewing skills learned in Norway and brought to America to make this dress. In the next slide, we'll see this first dress and look at it in a little bit more detail and talk about the family history. Karen Stensrud Haugen was the maker, and she was from Modum, Viken, Buskerud, Norway. This area is near the town of Drammen, just outside of Oslo. A story about this dress was given by the family. Karen made the dress for her marriage to Peter Haugen. They married in Modum, Buskerud in 1840. A quote from a descendant states, "Since Karen was several years older than her husband, she never admitted how many, she used to add piquancy to family arguments by remarking that she spent 7 years making her wedding dress and that she had to allow time for him to grow up and marry her." Karen and her husband immigrated to Pierce County, Wisconsin, near Martell in west central Wisconsin in 1850. And they became a well-known family in the area. Their son, Nels, one of 6 children, became a longtime congressman from Wisconsin. And one of their descendants became a well-known fashion designer at the time. But I don't know more about that descendant. But at least we can think that Karen's skills were admired and handed down. Information which accompanied the donation also included this quote: "Red-haired Karen Haugen, according to family accounts, spun the yarn used in the dress, dyed it, designed it, and executed every stitch by hand." In the next slide, we'll see both the front and back views. It can be described as a one-piece wool dress, meaning the bodice and the skirt were probably made individually, but then permanently stitched together. It's of multicolored plaid. It's fitted at the waist with a gathered skirt, long cuffed sleeves, pleated caps on the sleeves, would have been puffier perhaps with a sleeve inside. It has a plain neckline, though we will see that an accessory called a peroline would have been worn as a decorative accessory to accentuate the neckline. The dress looks rather simple and unembellished for a wedding dress, though its naturally dyed colors are still very stunning, and there's a vibrant sheen to the fabric. In the next slide, we'll show how understructure and accessories add life to the figure. The fashion design shows that the silhouette of dresses were certainly enhanced through accessories and underwear. We can't be sure, but this does indicate that underwear might have supported that fullness at the top of the sleeve with these puffy sleeve supports, which would have been worn as part of the underwear. Other pieces of underwear included a petticoat, which has cording for stiffening, and it's worn over a corset and a chemise and underneath the drawers would have been worn as well. In the next slide, we'll see actual photograph of close to that time period showing that accessory of what a pearline would look like. This is a daguerreotype from the early 1840s, and photography also was just invented at that time. And so Karen would not have had photographs to look at when she was designing her dress, but she might have had sketches to look at and other dresses that would have come into her area. The figure on the right is a dressed figure that is also in a hand-woven dress, and it's accessorized at a exhibit at the Nordiska Museum in Stockholm. But it shows the fact that the neckline could also be finished off with a detachable white collar, which is very common. And the common outerwear for the time was a shawl. In this case, it would have been a cashmere shawl, but certainly a more simple homemade shawl would have been used as well. Let's zone in closer in the next slide, and we'll see the front and back. First, on the front, you notice across the front, the stripes are not quite matched. The color bands are not matched. And then notice that the neckline has cording around it, a very simple finish. We look at the fitting on the bodice as accomplished through darts that radiate from the waist, and the waist is straight across. On the back, you can see there's shaping of this back piece by what we call princess seams. Often they go from the arm's eye to the waist. And what I've discovered is it's not actually a separate piece with a seam joining. It's actually a very smooth tuck taken in one back piece. And that curved seam then serves a functional purpose, but it also serves an aesthetic purpose in really making the eye go to that small center back, and it makes the waist appear smaller. We can also take a look at the next slide and see that the opening is down the center front with hooks and eyes, and it leads to a left side opening of the skirt. This front opening allowed women to dress themselves. Instead of what you see in the fashion plates, the dresses are always shown as opening down the back, but that would have required help in the household to accomplish dressing. So all these dresses have this very similar front closure. You see the lining is exposed here, and that full back piece, in this case, is not fitted in the same way as the outside fabric, but it's fitted with one single dart down the center. The next slide will show us a close-up of how those princess seams or tucks were coming in to join the waistband. And there's a stitch called a prick stitch that's holding them flat. And it's also holding the edge of the waistband to the bodice. We see that between the waistband and the bodice, there is a corded seam. And then you look at what from further back looked like gathers, but it is actually cartridge pleats that is moving in all the fullness of the skirt into the smaller waist. And I'll show you in the next slide how a cartridge pleat is actually done. Those pleats in the dress we're looking at right now are just springing out of these controlled pleats because the fabric itself is so bouncy. But normally in fabric that is that can take pleats more specifically, they are folded like you see in this diagram. In order to accomplish the pleats, you measure distance between your stitches, as you see in the upper left, and then pull on the ends of those stitches until the pleats come to a certain measurement, in this case, the back of the skirt. And then you have to hand stitch each individual pleat to the bodice. And then the final picture shows the outside that allows those pleats to just have a beautiful shape coming off the waist. And this is a stitch which cannot be accomplished by a sewing machine. It's one of those things that pretty much died out as the sewing machine came in. In the next slide, we'll see two images side by side. The left is an outside view of the hem area of this dress, and the right is an inside view of the hem. On the outside view, a couple of things are interesting. One, we see skirt panels that don't quite match either. And I'm not saying that Karen was not an excellent seamstress. She could match if she wanted to. But I think the issue for both the bodice and the skirt is that she had a limited amount of fabric. And so then you are able to do what you can do in terms of matching your plaids all the way around the skirt or the bodice. This is interesting too, because in the left side, you can see obviously this hole that had been worn in the hem. And I love the fact that she had saved some of her fabric to patch that hole. On the right, you see how the hem is carefully protected. The edge of the hem has horsehair braid that is folded over the very edge. And then there's a deep facing of glazed linen that protects the hem and continues as long as the dress can survive. That will take the most abrasion. Let's go on to the next slide, where we're showing a selvage edge, and this is on the inside of the dress. In looking at the weaving of this dress, each of the panels were woven at 22.5 inches wide, and the warp was set at 55 ends per inch. The warp yarn is a very tight spin, and the weft is woven at 44 ends per inch, and the weft has a quite loose spin to it. The woven structure is a variation on crepe weave, which is usually based on a twill or a satin structure. This weave results in no apparent lines or visible repeat. And in Karen's fabric here, we see widely spaced, randomly appearing floats that enhance the shine of the fabric. And they also contribute to a soft and resilient drape. I like the crepe weave as a fabric for clothing, and I have appreciated the fact that the 20th century Annie Elbers said of the crepe weave, it's a useful weave suited mainly for clothing. So way back, it was that way too. We can look also in this slide and think about the fibers and hand spinning of this dress. And Lorraine and I have worked together on this somewhat, and we have noticed the fact that this dress weighs so little compared to other dresses in the collection. And so decided to, well, let's actually weigh them. This dress weighs about 1.5 pounds. And the other two collection dresses we're looking at each weigh 3.75 pounds. So they both would have approximately the same yardage within them. So it's the fabric construction and the fiber itself, we think, that contributes to that lightweight. Why is it so lightweight? Well, the Norwegian origin initially made me think of the Spelsau sheep, which is indigenous to Norway. with a famously lightweight, long, and lustrous guard hair in its double-layered coat. So I began corresponding with Annemor Sundbo, who wrote the book about the Norwegian spellsow sheep. And so far, our email exchange has led to another possibility as well. She believes, yes, this looks like it could be the guard hair of a spellsow lamb, perhaps, or the hair of an Angora goat. More commonly in fabric form, now it's called mohair, and sometimes called camel wool. Annemor suggested that mohair singles yarn or fiber for spinning was available in Karen's time in Norway. So the resulting yarns and fabrics of these fibers felt and looked a lot like silk, which is quite a bit like Karen's dress here. There is more follow-up to do in order to study this further, because just in the last few days, I received an email from Loran, still wondering about this dress. And she actually put a couple of fibers under the microscope and found that, yes, the weft is very loosely spun, very long wool fibers. You can see the scales, but the warp appears to be a cellulosic fiber, perhaps cotton, which also could have been available, in which case this would have been called a half wool dress because if the warp is cotton. But it is certainly a phenomenal fabric to experience in hand. Okay, let's go to the next slide and take a moment to ask your questions about Karen's dress. And as I said, we don't have all the questions answered, but it's certainly an interesting history to further pursue. Let's go on to the next one, where we'll see this dress from the 1850s, also made before emigration. It was made by Bede, Ola's daughter, Jorgensen, and she wore the dress as one of 3 that she owned throughout her adult life. So it served its purpose throughout her life. The history of Bede and her husband relate that they came from North Norway in the region near Trondheim, and they emigrated from Norway to Turner County, South Dakota, near Centerville, which is in southeast South Dakota. The information came from a granddaughter of Bede, who grew up on the farm where her grandparents homesteaded in South Dakota. She said the dress was made from a paper pattern cut out of Norwegian newsprint, which was saved for many years by the family, along with the dress. Bede gave one dress to each of her 3 daughters. This one went to Bertha, the mother of the donor. The story was handed down that Bede soaked the flax to get the strands to make the linen, and sheared the sheep, washed the wool, carded the wool, dyed the wool, spun the wool and the linen, and wove the wool and linen for the dress. It gets to be, almost a rote statement that you can hear from donors often. And in it, maybe you wonder whether the story can actually be true or not, but I'm taking this as truth. They might not have known what the strands of linen should have been called, but they understood the work that went into it and saved it. Bede and her husband brought a loom from Norway to their homestead, possibly the one on which the dress was woven. They lived first in a sod house, and then a one-room house that the loom was in. And then eventually Christian built a 6-bedroom home. And the granddaughter remembers that there was a huge loom in that house. The importance of the large loom in her memory makes me certain that Bede continued to weave in America. And possibly she wove for others as well as her own family, as there were immigrant weavers who made an income from their weaving, selling or bartering their home woven yardage with other members within their community. Next slide, we'll see this as a one-piece wool dress, brown with horizontal black stripes. It's sequined in the stripes are sequenced in 11-inch repeats. The bodice dips at the waist to a soft point. In this dress, that point marks it as the decade of the 50s. There are shaping darts or tucks on the front that allow for alterations and also provide the needed ease for the bust. There's ample wrist fullness in the sleeve, and it is brought together with a cuff at the end. There's very thin green rickrack trim embellishing the cuffs and the center front seam, or closure, I should say. And the skirt is box pleated around the sides and in the back. And if you look closely, you can see at the center back, there's about 3 inches of cartridge pleating, creating a lot of extra fullness right at the center back. And you can't see it now, but you'll see it later. There's a right-hand pocket inserted to the seam of the skirt. Let's continue on to the next slide. The fronts of all these 3 dresses are similar in how they open. And on this one, now the open side, you can see one of those alterations that I have mentioned. Each of these dresses are easily altered, both by manipulating the amount of fabric taken up in the darts and also by rearranging the pleats in the front. So in this case, the last time this dress was altered, it was done with a sewing machine. And you might be able to see the black thread that was used to do the dart, so that was quite a bit later after it had been used and worn. Let's go on to the next slide. And here we are starting to go inside to see what kind of seams were used to do the sewing. And you can also get a nice view of the hand-woven linen lining here. We can see hand-sewn backstitch seams with very small seam allowances. And the seam allowances are stitched together with an overcast stitch, keeping the edges protected from raveling. This is the usual kind of seam that we find in fashionable handmade dresses of the late 19th century, mid to late. Let's go to the next slide where you can see more seams. The armscye seam attaching the sleeve has the same kind of seam as those shoulder seams we were looking at before. Back stitching, very small back stitching, and overcast seam allowances together. But the side back seam that you see, the vertical seam, is a very unusual seam to find within one of these fashionable dresses. It's called a spilosome seam, and it is actually primarily had been used for clothing within the folk dress tradition. So Bede would have learned this at home in Norway, and then that would have been still in common use at that time. But we see very few of these in garments that were cut to be fashionable and therefore perhaps not intended to be saved for generations, like in the folk dress tradition. I have studied a few fashionably cut dresses in the Norse Folk Museum with this same seaming in the bodice. And it's been fun to go back while I've been looking at this dress to look at those notes. And I found currently you can actually find one on Norway's Digitalt Museum website that shows inside views of one of those dresses, and that will be in my references. Let's go on to the next slide because I'm talking about this spilosome stitch, and this makes it a little more clear what it is. The lining and the outer fabric are sewn at the same time. And this stitch allows you to join 2 pieces edge to edge while enclosing all the raw edges in just one go with hand stitching. it's very well suited to hand-woven fabrics today also. So some of you in the audience might have taken my class where I do teach this technique. You have to hold the sandwich together as in the top diagram, and then the needle passes back and forth in a particular sequence. And then when you open it up, it looks like the bottom diagram, which we would look at and think it was a feathered stitch or a baseball stitch. The next slide shows another piece from the Vesterheim collection. This is an older piece that is from 1807, and it is a bodice from the folk dress tradition. In this case, this spilosam technique has been used for all of the bodice seams, and it's made out of this beautiful Kalamuk fabric, which would be also of the mohair fiber, most likely, that we talked about the first dress. Let's go on to the next slide. Now we're back to Betty's wool dress, and I have moved us down into the skirt, some of the long seams that join panels of woven fabric together, and these are seams that are also done in the backstitch. But in the skirt, the backstitch can be done with a much longer stitch, and on the left you can see how it looks when you're stitching it together, but on the back side, the back stitch seam looks quite different. It looks like all the stitches are overlapping. On a skirt, the seam itself wouldn't receive the stress as in the bodice or the armscye. So you can imagine that this longer stitch would be just as practical to use as a join for the skirt. Let's go to the next slide. And here we're looking at the waist of the skirt from the inside. A few things I'd like to point out are the box pleats, which you can see at the top of the slide, and at the center back, they're overlapping, and they're overlapping the cartridge pleats that you saw from the outside. So when you feel this waist seam, it is very thick at that point and would have taken very sturdy hand stitches to get through and hold it together. And well, actually, there's a term for that, where you stab through all those layers. There are many stitches involved in this construction. In the front of this slide, you see a couple of other examples of hand-woven fabrics. Actually, there are 5 hand-woven fabrics that we see in this dress. And the front waistband, which would be hidden when the dress is closed, is a plaid linen fabric. And then the long pocket, which is the piece across the middle there, is also a beautiful piece of hand-woven linen. In the next slide, we'll see the 5th fabric that was used to make the dress. And it is the facing of the hem that is of brown linen and also natural colored linen made into a very subtle plaid. And it's used as that glazed linen had been in the previous dress to protect the inside of the hem. You're also looking at the very edge of the hem here. And in the previous dress, there was a tape, a horsehair tape that enclosed the edge. Here, it's a different technique to protect against abrasion. It's a cord called a fingeret snore, which means the finger cord. And it's stitched directly to the edge, to the end. The stitching goes into the seam and catches the seam of between the facing and the wool for this hem. It's a technique that results in a cord that's very elastic and very flexible and yet sturdy. And it might look like what knitters use an I-cord or a crocheted cord, but it is actually a 2-loop construction. Before we go on to the next slide, I want to point out on the left the fact that there is a growth tuck also close to the hem on this dress. And you can see that from the outside. You think maybe it might be decorative, but it can serve that purpose, but it is also very functional in that if the dress is handed to someone else who's taller, that growth tuck could be let down. But also, if despite all this care to protect the hem finally gets worn through, you can let that tuck down and establish a new hem just as good as new. Let's go on to the next slide. And this shows actually the process of making the fingerets, nor a finger cord that you put on the edge of the hem. I've found it useful, and I like to use it also for edging of hand-woven garments. And it's fun to make. Actually, I've been told that in Norway, children learn to do it so they can make their own cords that keep their mittens from getting lost, those beautiful hand-knit mittens. And you can see how the 2 loops are interlooped with your fingers in the diagram below. Let's go on to the next slide. And we're going to look more closely at the weave here. This is a close-up of that growth tuck, so it's got some dimension to it. This dress has rather simple weaving in that it is a plain weave. The weaving width is 25.5 inches, and it's wool singles warp set at 34 ends per inch, and wool singles weft also at 34 ends per inch. I think even though it's a simple weave, we can still admire Bedé's accomplishment a great deal, having done all the steps from the sheep to the dress at a very young age. It's a bold choice, I think, to make such a large 11-inch repeat for her dress. From studying hand-woven dresses and their histories around in Norway museums, I have understood that the learning curve had to start quite early, and Norwegian girls who learned to weave within their community of weavers usually would weave the fabric and construct a dress for their own conformation. And then that would be their first marking. And then the next big accomplishment would be one that would qualify as a dress for her wedding. So further advances in the skills, all these skills that have to go into a dress. The next slide is a break between dresses. But this is a nature scene that has a connection to Bedé's home in some way. I found it on the website of Centerville, South Dakota, which was her hometown. I just saw this sign and I said, will this trail lead to Bedé's home? As I mentioned earlier, some women in the immigrant population continued to weave their clothing fabric in their new homes. And some became renowned for their sturdy and fine fabrics. And so it would be really interesting to know if Bedé was such a weaver, and that Vesterheim would mean that this trail might lead to a weaver's place. But that's for another day to answer. Next, we'll go on to our third dress. This is a dress woven and made in Wisconsin after immigration. And the maker was Ellen Margrethe Andersdotter. And after looking at this history of it, which said she had a loom and everything to go with it, I found that we just had more and more questions about it. It does seem as if the history of Ellen's marriage, coming from Yerpen, Telemark to Wisconsin, would have made it most likely that this dress was made after her marriage in the US, and the style of the dress they came in the 1850s. This was a style very much in the 1860s, would indicate the dress was made in the US, but we wondered if the materials perhaps would have come from Norway. So we asked more and more questions, and we decided that we would send some of the samples off to be analyzed. So I'll tell you about that in a little bit, but more questions came from this dress. In the style details we're looking at, let's go on to the next slide. We'll see the back is again fitted with the princess seams. There are, again, box pleats, double box pleats in this case, all the way around. And it is trimmed with this, what appears to be commercially made trim. This next slide will show the dress in a little better silhouette form, because you can see that the dress fullness is primarily to the back, and that would have been enhanced by the underskirt. This was a mannequin that we dressed for an exhibition. This dress was in 1997. But in this view, you can see the shape of the sleeve so beautifully. The sleeve style is called pea pod shape. And then it's accessorized, as we saw before, with a removable collar and a belt and a soulier that both have silver that was probably brought from Norway. Let's go on to the next slide. And you can see the fact that the front of this dress has been rearranged so many times that the pleats are really not where they should be anymore. And this attests to the use of the dress initially by Ellen, who had 10 children probably during the time she wore this as her Sunday best dress. And then the dress was given to a church organization and was used in fundraising events and ladies' aid meetings for years to come. So let's move inside the dress here. And we'll see that, first, that the shape of that sleeve, it is not very economical as a shape to cut from hand-woven fabric, because it's a two-piece sleeve, and it is, the bottom half ends up being on the bias. So Ellen solved that problem beautifully with piecing the inside of the sleeve, which is, I think, beautiful to see. Let's go on to the next one. And here you can see how worn the inside is. At the neckline, it's actually worn away, but the closure is very much like we've seen before. Let's move ahead. And moving closer, actually, this is the one where I was able to figure out that these back seams were tucks and not seams, because I could actually look through the torn portion of the dress. Let's move ahead. I analyzed the pattern for this dress because sometime I would like to make a reconstruction of it. It's my dream to be able to do the spinning and the weaving also. I think I can handle the sewing. Let's move on to the next. This was beautiful in that the wear and tear on the dress also completely wore away the fabric covering on the cord that finished off the edge. And I had to figure out what the stitch was that held that cord right on the edge. And it's another one of those stitches that just cannot be done by a machine. And it is titled here in Norwegian that the thread crosses in the middle of the fabric underneath the cord. What I found beautiful about this technique is that it leaves the cord free so that you can pull up both ends after it's stitched in place. And so it permanently makes that edge three-dimensional and to conform with the size that you need it for your individual. Let's go ahead to the next slide. and see the traces of many, many alterations of those darts on the left side, and on the right side, another finely back-stitched seam with the seam allowances stitched together. The next slide takes us to the inside of the skirt and the long pocket that is part of the function of this dress. I love that. And also the hem facing on this skirt. Let's move ahead. I analyzed through sketching and measuring how much fabric it would take to weave to make this dress. And my conclusion was about 9 yards, measuring how much would go into each of those double pleats. Let's move ahead. And here you can see the weave and appreciate the structure of this. The left slide is the outside of the fabric, and the right slide is the inside of the fabric. I'll tell you what we're looking at here. The weaving width was 32 inches wide. The warp is cotton, very fine cotton, and it's set at 44 ends per inch. And the weft is wool, hand spun, and in 3 different colors. The 2 colors of brown and magenta, I'll call it, kind of a bright pink, are singles wool, and the white that separates them is a 2-ply of 1 ply of what the warp is, that cotton, and then a 2nd ply of very fluffy wool, so that it shows, especially on the outside of the fabric. This weave structure is 3-1 twill. So the outside of the fabric gets all the color, and the back side of the fabric shows more of the dull cotton warp. Let's go on to the next slide. Well, once this had been given to the church, the woman that is shown here wearing it received it, and she really appreciated everything within the work of the dress as she wore it for many events. And so when you maybe want to revisit this, you can take the time to read all of her stanzas. I won't do a reading right now, but that's her in the dress. And of course, that wouldn't be done with a museum dress. But at the time in 1942, it was what you did in order to raise money to save the church. Let's go on to the next slide. So we finished that dress. And if you have questions about that, you can take just a moment to jot those down. I'm going to go on quickly here to just show a few slides of my reconstruction process for a very similar dress. And this dress you can see at Vesterheim easily by going into the Ship Gallery, West Ship Gallery, and it has been standing there since I made it in the year 2000. And really, the process of making it led me to understand what I was looking at. So I've been going back and forth from making things to looking at older ones and going back and forth. And that has been my best way to learn. On this view, you can kind of see a nice view of the cartridge pleats and the back view on the right. And actually behind me is a dress that I made for practice before I made that. This dress is of cotton, and I made it to test the pattern before I made the one of wool for the gallery. I'll just mention in the next slide, thank you for that view. I'll mention in the next slide that I went to Norway and studied this dress. It's from Etnedal. It stayed in Norway. It didn't ever come to the US. Let's go on to the next slide. And I photographed my process along the way with big 8x10 prints of the original dress side by side so I could get it as close as possible to the original. This is the sleeve process of adding the cord. Next slide. Also, I did a lot of the hand stitching right on a dress form in order to make it as three-dimensional as possible so that it can live in space the way a dress made for a real body does. Go on to the next slide. The details, now you'll recognize very clearly the hem protection, the growth pleat, the cording on the bottom of the bodice, the hook and eye down the front. On to the next slide. You can see this, as I said, in the gallery, but go on to the next slide. If you want to see these dresses or other hand-woven dresses in the collection, Loran would just ask that you make an appointment. And there are actually hand-woven garments for men, women, and children of this whole immigrant period in the collection that I would say, I chose these highlights, you might choose your own. Go on to the next slide, which is the end of my talk, really. So I am ready for if any questions came in along the way. And I'd love to see Loran again, if I can see your picture too.
Absolutely. We had several good questions come in, and we have time, I think, for 4 or 5 of them.
Okay.
One of them that came in was asking about the difference between fashion cut and folk style. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the folk style we think of as more static than fashionable, but not completely static. Some, they're in the countrysides of Norway and other countries. People remain a little bit isolated, and so make garments that can be handed down, and probably in a similar style for a longer period of time. Once the news of fashion comes in, people need to have what is latest. And so the style then is gleaned from sources further away. And in this case, in the late 19th century, the style changes at least every decade, and as opposed to maybe every generation or two in folk dress.
Wonderful.
Carol, there is a kind of a multi-part question here. Was it common for young women to have such excellent tailoring skills? And how might a young woman learn those skills?
In the time period that I'm looking at, I would have to only speculate, but because I think it all happened within pretty tight communities, generation to generation. I think it wasn't always just from your mother's knee or your grandmother's knee being at that close by, but it was from the community of weavers and sewers. And you learned all those skills, just like my grandmother said, well, now it's time to learn to embroider, and now it's time to learn to crochet. They were life skills, not just hobby skills, that's for sure.
Oh, sorry, I was muted there. Another question that came in was asking about the use of cotton in the dresses from the 1840s and 70s. Cotton was available at that point in Norway, but it was less available. Was it imported from England? Was it expensive? Was using cotton a statement of the weaver's family's status?
I think it would require an exchange of money, which if you can, make your own product, then you do. But if, you have some cash that you're going to invest for, in this case, in the 1840s, of a wedding dress, then in this case, the fiber the wool fiber too might have been a purchase if it was mohair. And so that does indicate some resources. And in terms of the actual route that these materials took at that time, that's more questions that I need to work at answering as well.
Carol, we've had quite a few questions about the trim, the braid that was used on the hem of dress number 2, the fingret snore cord. Could you tell us what that was made from and at what point that was put onto the hem of the skirt?
Right. I have understood from Norwegian curators that I've worked with that it was made of tightly spun wool, which might have also included some hair, because that would help it withstand more abrasion. And it is put on after the hem is completely finished, after the facing is put on as well. And I think it's just a wonderful finish for the edge of hand-woven garments. So I put it on, say, edging of vests and even on other seams as well between pieces. It's very versatile.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. There are a couple questions that have come in asking about the dyes that were used in this period, the natural dyes and other things like that. Especially curious about the first dress, it sounds like.
Okay, first dress, I will say I have not analyzed, but it is a naturally dyed set of fibers because it is from that date before synthetic dyes were in place. It's got that beautiful lavender purple to it, which I could just speculate here saying maybe it's a lichen. In the final dress, I don't think I went into the detail there. That's what I was just speaking about. In the final dress, the one with the brown and magenta stripes, back in '97, when Loran and I put this into an exhibit at Vesterheim, we decided to send off a few fibers to a laboratory and had them analyzed. And the brown is walnut, and the pink color is actually orchil lichen. And so that is one of the determining factors to help us believe that this was made in Wisconsin, because the walnut actually is native to the American Midwest in Wisconsin. It's not native to Norway, but the lichen would have been available both places. So that's the best answer I have, not for the right dress, but as I said at the beginning, more analysis has to be done.
Great. And the last question, Carol, on dress number 2, Bedit's plaid dress, do you have any information about the EPI and PPI of the linen lining fabric?
I think I do, but not with me today. I had to abbreviate some things, and so I could correspond to that person by email happily, and I would find those notes.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, Carol, on behalf of Vesterheim and everybody in attendance, I just want to extend a huge thank you to you for today's program. It's been just absolutely wonderful, and thanks to all of you for attending as well.